Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I am delighted today to be, of course, joined by Steve Damaris, and I'm going to pass it along to Steve now because he is going to welcome a very special guest.
Yeah, Bronson, it's really great to have a special guest with us today. Everybody's familiar with the MSU Deer Lab as the kind of the base of our operations, but we have kind of the founding father of the MSU Deer Lab, Dr. Harry Jacobson, with us today. Harry started at Mississippi State in the 1970s, and I was excited as a young professional to come down and go to grad school under him. And Harry, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here, Steve and Bronson. Miss seeing you guys, but it's great to see your faces. And after all the COVID withdrawals, so.
Yeah,
Harry,
we're still
great
not
to see you.
together, but at least we're visual.
Yeah, we haven't gotten any prettier, and I still don't have any hair, so some things never change.
Well, I'm about to join you on the hair. Mine keeps disappearing.
It'll do that to you.
Well, Harry, we do go a long way back because I started under you as a graduate student in 1977 and worked on my master's, and then you invited me to stay for my PhD, and that was all such a blessing for me to be able to be a part of that early research. And thinking back, I remember you helped kind of build the foundation of who I was professionally. And one of the things I remember you just really pounding into the cadre of graduate students that were under you is, we are involved in research and we got to do things that are of benefit to the resource. And that's just kind of was your mantra back then, and learn information that's going to help with the management of the resource. And I've lived that, and Bronson lives it as well. So it's a great founding father of the lab, founding that principle with us.
Well, that's nice of you to say, Steve. I think the greatest accomplishment that I can point to is that I've got students, and particularly you, and Bronson as a side person to also input some knowledge too. But the greatest accomplishment has been being able to see my students perform and outperform me in creating new knowledge for the management of the wildlife resources in general. Yeah.
It's been a great collective cooperative effort amongst a bunch of people, and you were instrumental in making me appreciate the relationship with our state wildlife agency back in those days, and working with agencies and helping them answer the research questions that they need to properly manage the resources. And of course, the three of us here have focused a lot on deer over our years, but we've done a lot of other things too. But I saw a presentation about a year ago by QDMA, Kip Adams. He did a survey of southeastern state agencies, and the report he gave was that 80% of the effort by state wildlife agencies in the southeast goes towards deer. And good or bad, right or wrong, that's just the fact of life for state agencies. And so us being able to work with that species and address the needs has really been a great blessing and a lot of fun for me. And I know Bronson and I'll bet for you too, Harry.
Yeah, it's I couldn't pick anything else I'd like to do more dearly than work with the deer. So.
So
well, I've got one comment
okay,
real quick, Steve. We're kind of going down memory lane here, and we're talking about how good it is to see each other, and it is. But I think everyone in the deer management world loves to see Harry Jacobson, loves to see him coming, loves to have a conversation with him, except one group of people. There's one group of people that do not like to see Harry Jacobson stand up and go to the microphone.
Yes.
And that's all us graduate students that were up at the Southeastern Deer Study Group presenting our research. And, if you could put some kind of sensor on people's knees or their heart rate or something, it's like, oh, God, I hope I was going to make it through my presentation without Harry Jacobson asking me a question. So you do know that, don't you, Harry?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I believe in holding students to task. Yeah.
Yep. It's a great way to challenge us. If we can't defend our work in front of a 300 or 400 professionals, then we don't need to be in the place that we're at.
Yeah. That's for sure.
And I don't think you ever stumped Bronson.
No, I don't think so. I don't think I stumped you either.
Well, you guys have that's very kind, but you have very bad memory, because my very first presentation when I was a master's student, Harry Jacobson, like, how can this be? I'm up there on the I was like the third speaker or fourth speaker, I don't know, and it was right after lunch, if I remember correctly, and you were not in the room. Because, buddy, I was looking and watching. I'm like, gosh, good, Harry's not in the room. And about the presentation before me, I see him walk in, and he parks it like on the front row. And Harry did ask me a question, and I completely botched it. I mean, I still to this day remember how horrific my answer was. So I failed, Harry.
Well, you made up for it.
I hope. Hopefully, I made up for it. Yeah.
That's a great recollection, Bronson, and I mean, I've had a lot of other students over the years that have said the same thing too. That, oh, here comes Jacobson, watch out. So, it's a great. I mean, it truly is a good thing to be critical and challenge our information, because if we can't discuss it among professionals, then how can we validly discuss it to our stakeholders?
It falls within the peer review of the of science with the empirical method. If you can't justify your results, then you need to go back to the drawing board.
Well, Steve, why don't you two kick us off in like how it all got started years ago?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't the first student in the Deer Lab. I think there were a couple others that came in right before me, but I know I was there at kind of at the ground zero with you and Dave Gwynn, your colleague that moved on to other places shortly after that. But yeah, thinking back about the first projects that at least I was involved with, and that was early in the life of the Deer Lab. And Harry, you developed a relationship with the state agency, and they had a lot of needs relative to deer research. And can you kind of think back and think about what their needs were then and why you did what you did, you and Dave Gwynn? Well,
I was very fortunate in that we were able to, I was able to come on board Mississippi State at a time when Mississippi was struggling financially for research support, and what was happening was basically they were having to turn their Pittman-Robertson money back in because they couldn't support the matching fund part of those funds, and so they were losing lots of money that could have gone to research annually. And as a result of efforts primarily by Edsel Clyburn, who was the research director for the Mississippi Department at that time, Dave Gwynn and myself, we were able to develop a program where we essentially became the research arm of the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. And we were able to use our university salaries and work as overhead funds to match the Pittman-Robertson requirements. And that turned into just a wonderful relationship between the department and the university that's carried through to this day. And I think it's unlike any other state in the country. And one of the reasons that Mississippi is, in my opinion, the top wildlife research agency and state management agency in the country. There's no other one like it that has made so many advances and really with minimal staff compared to what other state agencies have had over the years. When I came on board, I think Mississippi had 6 wildlife biologists total to do everything that they had to do, and that hasn't grown that much since then. But the output is unlike any other state.
What were some of the topics that were hot back then that needed to be addressed?
Well, of course, on the deer management side, the issues of overpopulation, particularly in the coastal plain and well, statewide. There was like almost every place in the country in those days. Does were the sacred animal that, like the sacred cow. The doe harvest was not a thing that was appreciated at that point in time, and one of the major issues that we had to accomplish was to convince the public that managing deer populations meant managing the whole population, not just the buck segment of the population. And I can remember doing meetings across the state with the public and the state agency where literally I had to have conservation officers walk into the meeting with me and walk out because I didn't know what kind of anger I would create and what might be the consequences of that. So, but wow. We were able to demonstrate largely through the research that we were conducting, some of which you were a major part of, determining health indices for measuring deer welfare and using those in a management context. That we were able to show that there was substantial overpopulation in many parts of the states where we were seeing 100% spike yearling bucks, extremely low body weights, all symptoms of malnourishment, and we were able to, because we were able to show that, garner public support for a population management that was sound for deer and sound for their habitat.
As I remember,
Steve, would it be good right here for a lot of our people that are younger than us, and that's not hard at all to be younger than us, but I find sometimes that a lot of people that are younger don't understand why there was such a response like Harry was describing, because doe harvest is so commonplace now. But we were talking about a time and people that grew up with no deer or very few deer on the landscape. And so it literally took a couple decades for populations to build. And then people like Harry were there at a time when, through their research and observations and feedback with biologists, we're starting to notice these density-dependent effects. That density was negatively impacting the population, and just provide a little background there to what Harry was talking about. It was a really different time.
Yeah, and Harry, you spent probably your first 10 years or so literally educating a generation of hunters and new, younger, upcoming hunters about just the need for population regulation involving the doe component, the demographic.
Yeah, absolutely, and you know that issue that Bronson just talked about in terms of the deer numbers increasing dramatically over time from populations that were near extinction and were, in some cases, in some states, extirpated to the late 60s and early 70s, when those populations finally caught up with a habitat that was available to support them. I grew up as a kid in Michigan, where I saw that at a lot earlier time, because the Midwest lake states always had fairly high populations of deer. And I can remember in the 50s walking through the woods in mid-central Michigan, and after a severe winter, and literally seeing 40 or 50 deer, dead deer, in a few hundred acres, and Michigan, I think, was, they went through that battle well before what we did in the Southeast. And fortunately, I had that experience to draw on and to realize what kind of public effort that would take to turn things around.
Well, since we're talking about density so much, Harry, I remember when I was a master's student, one of your studies that had a really big impact on me, because it was a time series that, and I can't remember the venue that you presented it at, maybe the biology of deer or something like that, but it was essentially your case study at Davis Island. And you had this terrific, I want to say close to 20 years, certainly 15 or so years of where you were tracking all the normal metrics of deer management, the body weight and antler size and lactation, etc. And you had this perfect correlation with I believe it was a 2-year lag.
Exactly, yeah.
Where you tracked body weight and you were tracking numbers in deer harvest, and then about 2 years was the best correlation. Post-harvest, you would see a perfect mirrored response of whatever metric you were looking at, and that was really a big deal. I mean, it was pivotal for me in understanding that relationship. I'm wondering how well was that accepted, and how much convincing and arm twisting did it take for you to get that level of harvest?
Well, I think it was because of the changes that we were able to demonstrate that we were able to get that level of harvest. And that data set was extremely helpful in convincing the hunting clubs on Davis Island and others to realize that managing that deer population through doe harvest was basically the only way to keep it in balance with its habitat. And we were able to show that not just at Davis Island. We had a similar database for Knoxville National Wildlife Refuge, which had showed the same metrics. Now, when you get down to the coastal plain, where you don't see that density response as quickly because of such a lower quality in habitat and environment, that it wasn't as easy to demonstrate there. But when we were doing health checks at the wildlife management areas, I think Red Creek and Leaf River, we were able to show, yearling buck weights that were averaging 40 pounds dress weight, which should have been fawn weights, and those populations down there were, you would still see fairly high energy stores because they were getting the energy, they just weren't getting the protein. There was enough gallberry and other things down there that were relatively high in energy, but very low in protein, and we were able to show what deer were doing to their environment as well. We put some exclosures up down there, and we're able to demonstrate the disappearance of plants completely because of the deer numbers that were present, and all of the valuable browse species that the only way to maintain those is to keep deer at much lower densities than they were being kept at.
So density dependence was and is operating in that part of the country. It's just not as sensitive. You're not going to have as an immediate of a response as you would in a place like Davis Island, or a place with a lot of food readily available.
Absolutely,
high quality food, I should add.
And that relates back to the productivity of the soils, which you guys know well. You've been following the relationship between soil fertility and deer metrics, and we were able to show that too, and thank you for following on with that work so diligently, and to the point where I think we really do understand the relationship between the soils and the plant and animal environment that they produce.
Harry, sorry, Steve. I'm just, some of these memories just are popping up. But
go right ahead.
And I think Harry, you and I even corresponded about this a year or so ago. But I remember another one of those case studies you did was in Florida.
Yes. Yeah.
And I believe it was the relationship you're describing, even to a further extent, relative to the number of deer that had to be removed from that landscape before you started to see a density-dependent response. And I think the response variable you were using was recruitment, or fawns at heel, or something like that. Relative to that, Harry, back in those days, were food plots and mechanisms like that to add a lot more quality forage on the landscape, was that even a thing back in those days?
No, nowhere near like it is today. when I grew up as a youngster, in those times, deer management or deer hunting was totally different from what we see across the landscape today. I grew up at a time when the primary deer hunting group was numbers of hunting camps with large numbers of people, and that with a very short season where everything was a social event. People got together and they did manned deer drives. You might have 40 hunters from a given camp go out and do a manned deer drive, and then the whole thing went back to a social experience without really the connection to the land that we see in the deer hunting base today, where I think deer hunting is still a very social thing, but it's much more a smaller group of folks usually, and it's a year-round thing with landowners managing that resource for recreational benefit, but also for the environment that they're involved with. It's a totally different experience today, I think, from what it was 40, 50 years ago. The hunters are much more educated today and much more involved in the stewardship of the properties that they hunt on.
Speaking of that education, Harry, one last little comment, Steve. I've had so many people, another one of these random thoughts comes up. I've had so many people, Harry, over the years with my extension and outreach program, and will come up to me and talk about the programs you and others used to deliver so many years ago. And I thought it would be gratifying for you to know that so many people still remember that, and it still had an impact, and they always tell me to tell you hello, and they appreciated it.
Well, thank you for that.
Likewise, Harry, I've had that happen dozens of times at presentations throughout the state.
Well, one of the biggest things that we were able to do was to use the Deer Lab as the hook, if you want to call it that, to get people to come out and learn about deer. I mean, everybody wanted to come see the deer pens and the deer within the deer pens, and we were able to put on a short course, literally with the support of the state agency, state wildlife agency, and probably the first participants in that deer short course were the agency personnel themselves, and myself and the wildlife biologists within the agency put on a day-long course covering all aspects of the white-tailed deer, and it was extremely well received. And we ran, I can't tell you how many people we ran through that over about a 10-year period. That and they all became ambassadors to again for the stewardship of the white-tailed deer resource.
And things change over time, and maybe if I can remember both things by the time we're done talking here, but one of the things is, you can't just do some research one decade and solve the problem for the next 40 years. And the example for that, in my mind, is Bronson led a supplemental analysis from that Davis Island harvest data from the next 15 years after your database. And Bronson, you want to kind of summarize, as I recollect, the how it changed, the responses of the animals kind of changed compared to Harry's time frame?
Yeah, so, and gosh, Steve, that's, I hate to say it too, but it's been a number of years ago since I did that. But to me, the take home was, harvest was still important, of course, but we also documented some environmental effects. And of course, the biggie in that neck of the woods is the flooding effects that were taking place. But we did not have as strong of a signal of density dependence that Harry demonstrated, simply because we did not have the variation in the swing of harvest level. So Harry, more or less, they had kind of moved into a stable strategy of harvest rates. So where you, and I'm making these numbers up, but you had maybe advocated for a swing of an additional 300 or 500 or whatever, we had to analyze the data set relative to a swing of an additional 50 deer or 75 deer. And we saw some subtle effects, but not near what you saw, because we didn't have the variation in harvest level.
Yeah, by that time they were managing numbers at a level where they weren't anywhere near carrying capacity. They were managing at a sustained level where habitat was not being damaged from one year to the next because of their harvest practices.
Yeah, and I think you've probably seen it with a lot of properties you've worked with, Harry, and we've seen it as well, as hunters kind of get to this workload level for deer management, and doe harvesting is part of the work of deer management. Everybody loves to shoot a big buck, but the real work and the way you get to the better deer is through the day-to-day, what you need to do to manage the deer population. And so I think at Davis Island and a lot of places across Mississippi and the Southeast and probably the U.S., hunters they've gotten over the fact that they need to keep shooting more and more does. They've reached that saturation point. And so we just didn't have any of those additional pushes. I think if we could have doubled the doe harvest, like, you probably in your data set, you were going from, a 1x increase to a 2x, maybe a 3x in the number of does that we're harvesting. They just couldn't do that anymore. They'd reached that saturation point, and that's why we need to keep doing more research over time as circumstances change to learn these nuances. And then talking about generational education, Harry, you went from the 70s and into the 80s teaching hunters to harvest does, and then you were one of the founding factors and members of the Quality Deer Management Association, and that establishing the new paradigm of, okay, we got doe numbers reduced, now let's start protecting some bucks and letting them grow older. And could you touch on that a little bit for us, because that's kind of old hat for the younger people in deer management now, but it was new back then.
Sure. And we went through a time. Everybody likes to, wants to shoot a big buck. And when we first got into deer management in Mississippi and across the country, really, what we saw from the metrics was, 90% of the buck harvest was yearling bucks, and we realized that we were overexploiting that resource tremendously. And in fact, if you look back in terms of archaeological records, a natural deer population isn't anything like that. It's more towards a balanced sex ratio. Still, even in a archaeological sense, does always sort of dominate the population simply because they're longer lived than males, but the natural populations out there from archaeological ruins show that a high percentage of the population is composed of mature bucks, and the harvest strategies that most state agencies and private lands were using were basically maximum sustained harvests of bucks, and that created the dilemma of bucks just not surviving to the ages that they would produce the mature antler quality that any hunter wants to see. So we were involved in looking at ways of getting hunters to let those younger bucks walk and achieve the age. And when they did that, they saw dramatic improvements of the age structure and the antler quality of that resource across the state of Mississippi. The early attempts at that were, protect bucks by the number of points, and we all know that's not a really satisfactory way of protecting younger bucks, because you can have younger bucks with 8 points, yearling bucks with 8 points, and other strategies needed to be involved. And you can do that by limiting the harvest to 20-30% of the buck population, or you can do that by installing antler restrictions that are more realistic of age classes, beam length and antler spread, for example, are commonly used today. But as we went through that, and Davis Island's a good example, I was able to get the hunters on Davis Island to first restrict their harvest to antler beam lengths that were, I think, 15 inches at the time, which protected basically all the yearling bucks on Davis Island. And then when they did that, they saw that was working, but they wanted to go further, and they began to protect bucks with 20 to 22 inch beam lengths, and started harvesting those mature bucks that they all wanted to harvest, and tremendous change in the satisfaction from the hunting experience by letting those younger bucks walk and being able to see bucks act out their natural ways and watch them instead of shooting them. So big change in hunter attitude and also quality of the animals they were harvesting.
Steve, one thing you haven't talked about is I believe it was your PhD project where y'all did so much of, I think, a lot of the first research on using springtime doe harvest, or what we call spring health checks. And why don't y'all talk a little bit about how that began and what was the impetus for doing that? And because in a lot of places that is still used today.
It's about, as Harry mentioned earlier, about evaluating the health of the animal population back then in the early days, and Harry saw that. Well, I'm going to let you describe what you saw, Harry. How was it riding along in your boat?
Well, I mean, to be able to look at reproductive success, for example, and be able to look at the animal at the end of the winter period, which gave us the best barometer on what the actual health condition of those populations were, which you can't get from just looking at an animal in the fall. So we were looking at a whole range of different issues. Steve did a tremendous job on looking at at parasite levels, for example, and the relationship between density and nutritional condition and disease prevalence is an issue. It's something that's a major factor in the condition of those deer populations, but also a major indicator of the status of that population relative to its habitat. One of the things that I'd like to jump into is that whole role of nutrition as it relates to the resource. One of the things I've been able to do over the years, and particularly following my retirement from Mississippi State and working as a consultant for private lands, I've been able to watch some amazing accomplishments of change of deer quality due to change in harvest structure and change in nutritional quality of individual properties. And I can cite properties in Louisiana, Texas, and of course Mississippi, even New York, and some of the other areas that I've worked with over the years where once I got landowners and hunting clubs that owned those properties to come to the realization that they could greatly improve nutrition by bringing those deer numbers down to an adequate size for what the habitat would produce, and by planting food plots and doing other making other changes to the natural habitat through forest management, selective harvest, and things like control burning. All of those enter into that whole nutritional relationship. Been able to show those landowners that yes, you can really boost the quality of those animals. But one of the things that surprised me, I expected that, and primarily because we're keen on mature buck harvest, I expected in 5 to 6 years' time, once we got those populations in check, we would reach the optimum level of quality for those deer herds, and we did. We saw some remarkable changes. For example, I can think of Juniper Creek in South Mississippi, where we, in about 6 years' time after getting that deer population down, the owners of that property saw about a 20% gain in antler quality. Went from average mature bucks of 110 to 120 inches to 130 inches. And we rolled along at that level for another 5 years. And then all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, we saw major increases in antler quality, going from harvesting the best bucks at 130 inches to harvesting 160-inch bucks and average bucks over 140 inches. And I saw that time in and time out over, regardless of where I was working in North America, that it always seemed if we got things nutritionally right, that it took 10 years, and then all of a sudden we saw major increases in quality. And I never really got a handle on why that would be until you guys, my follow-ons, came in with the maternal generation effects and you've been able to demonstrate it so greatly that that first generation of female offspring from does that are raised on optimum nutrition, and the female and male offspring, yeah, you see a small jump in quality, but what happens is you see a tremendous jump in quality after you look at that second generation from that doe that was raised from a doe that had optimum nutrition and herself had optimum nutrition, and we saw that what you call epigenetic effect of maternal nutrition. And I've seen that in wild populations time and time again. And I now, if I talk to a landowner, and they say, how long will it take for me to get to where I want to go? I say, well, at least 10 years, because you've got you're harvesting bucks at 5 years of age, and you're going to have to go through 2 generations to get that second generation of bucks that will show that quality change. So.
It's what you ate is important, but just as importantly, it's what your mother ate and what your grandmother ate, and this type of scale. So you'll see a short-term response to the nutrition, whether it be the food plots or prescribed fire and forest management, etc. But yeah, it's that intergenerational effect that's really where the switches get flipped, and where you see the big gains. And Harry, it's just so wonderful to hear that you've had clients and people that are working with you that are sticking with it that long, because it really is. It's a program you got to stick with for a long time. But if you do, it's going to take about a decade. But that's when that's when you really see the big swings.
Yeah.
And it really speaks to landowners. You can tell them that, having data to support it and show them, and get them to appreciate that there's no quick fix in deer management. Yeah, you might see a quick response to some extent, but it's a long-term investment. It's a generational investment and long-term habitat improvement, the nutritional improvement for the deer population, addressing multiple generations. And there's some research out of Europe back in the World War II days that showed literally doubling body weights and antler sizes over 4 or 5 generations of deer. And I would love to, whoever follows me and Bronson in this situation may be able to speak to that 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a great achievement by the Deer Lab there at Mississippi State, and you guys to be able to demonstrate that.
Harry, this may be we can always cut it out if it's too weird of a question. something I've been thinking about. I think you're the perfect person to answer, because like we said earlier, you've worked in South Mississippi, the Gulf Coast, and to Florida, and then New York, and the Midwest, and all over the place. And how big of a constraint do you think it is for deer in the deep South physiologically having to deal with heat dissipation. And when all of us wildlife students are going through, we always talk about heat conservation and Bergman's rule, and the deer that are up north, they need to be bigger, to conserve heat, and the ratio of surface area to volume and all that. But it seems like in my mind we don't also look at the opposite effect of it is really advantageous physiologically for a deer in the deep south not to weigh 300 pounds. And do you think that's always going to be a limit when we're talking about antler size? Is because we have a correlation at a population scale between body size and antler size. Is that always going to provide the ceiling of expectations for southern deer, is dealing with dissipating heat?
Well, I absolutely think that the Bergman's rule does apply, that energy efficiency is having a small body and a high humidity and high temperature regime to be able to dissipate that heat is a major factor. Habitat's a major factor too. I think it's extremely important to have a closed canopy forest in the Mississippi and other southeastern states, at least to some degree, where bucks have and does for that matter have an escape environment where they can have that shade and coolness provided by the habitat to dissipate some of that heat stress. As to the relationship with antlers, that's kind of a different story. Northern Mexico and South Texas have traditionally produced, huge antlered deer, but on small bodies. And I think there's actually some heat dissipation from that antler growth and the velvet release of that heat during the summer months. So I don't know that necessarily has to be something that impacts antler growth per se, but definitely body size is a major factor in terms of the efficiency of that animal. And I've seen people who introduced northern deer on their properties, high fence properties in Texas, that were extremely stressed, and that second generation of antlers from those animals, or not second generation, but the second set of antlers from those animals after being released is always, of minor quality, almost without exception, and due to the stress.
There's a lot of lessons to be learned through talking about how things have been done and how they've changed over time, and there's always a need for new information. You talk, Harry, about the metrics that you used early on to help the agency convince the public, the data that you used to convince and to make an argument, and we still use data today. Have you had any back in when you were active in academia and the research output arena, did you have trouble with science deniers back then? I mean, that's kind of a thing nowadays. Is it new to us, or has that been around a while?
There's always been a segment of the population, and I think with deer management, that's probably more true than than many other things. That everybody's an expert when it comes to managing deer. So there's always been that component of deniers, and I see it even today. I mean, I see it in to a large degree in some areas, much more so than others, where they just refuse to even educate themselves of what information is actually out there. And I don't know how you break through that. If when we look at our society today and the polarization that exists, I think you're going to have that to a degree. All we can do is hope to educate the highest percentage of the people who will listen that we can.
Mm-hmm.
Harry, this may be an oversimplification, but in your years and years of experience, do you have any tips for people in terms of the properties or the hunting clubs that always had the most success did these one or two or three things? Did you ever see some commonalities that always existed with the people that were most satisfied 5 or 10 years later? They all did one or two or three of these particular things.
I think that the two things, number one, doe harvest. They all took that seriously, and I've never yet seen a place that deer have been over harvested at. To be truthful, that deer couldn't rebound in 1 or 2 years after substantial reduction. And two, I think protecting buck age. Those were the two factors that resulted in the most hunter satisfaction down the line. A lot of other magic bullets out there, what you plant in a food plot or whatever. Taking care of the habitat is always a major factor, and there's multiple ways of addressing how a particular property is managed, but realizing the limitations of the habitat as they relate to that deer population and achieving a substantial enough harvest. Yeah.
One more, Harry. As you know, because we're all reading the same journals and we're all at the deer study group seeing these same studies, there's absolutely no question that there have been some deer populations severely impacted by predators, and primarily some of the best examples with coyotes, and then when you add coyotes and bears, they eat a lot of fawns. Do you have any experience where that has really been devastating from a deer management perspective, or is it just kind of a new norm that, yeah, we've got a lot of fawns that are being eaten, and we have just simply responded by not needing to harvest as much does? How do you generalize the new predator context that we have now?
Well, I think it goes back to, that metric issue again. Being able to document, 20 years ago we couldn't do this, but now with camera surveys that we've developed where we can look at recruitment in the wintertime and get a good assessment of what actual fawn survival took place, and get a much better handle on the numbers of deer and both sexes that are and fawns that are present, we can deal with that. I personally, as you know, I own a little piece of property in Minnesota. It's covered up with bears, covered up with wolves, and I'm still covered up with deer. The predation is, the prey regulate the predator populations more so than the other way around, I think. It's it's that trophic pyramid that 10%. You got to have 10% can be predators, but 90% is going to be the prey. So it's those numbers are still going to do what they do.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I want to be respectful of Harry's time. I was thinking we're pushing about our normal hour mark here. Any other things you want to discuss with Harry before we have to go?
Well, I might follow up on your observation for your property in Minnesota, Harry. You don't see a big depredation effect from your bears and wolves. Is that because you have adequate fawning cover, hiding cover on your property, and that helps insulate the deer population from the predators?
I think that to a big degree. I mean, much of my property consists of young forest, cut over forest that's there that provides more escape cover. But I watch over the summer. I watch fawn numbers drop. Almost every doe early on has fawns that I'll photograph, and by the end of the summer, maybe 30% or 40% of those will still have fawns. So predation is a major factor in recruitment, but still the recruitment is more so than the habitat would stand long term. You're still going to have that female harvest to keep things in check, particularly as that habitat changes, like you just said. If where it goes from young forest to older forest, you're going to need even more substantial harvest to maintain that balance.
Well, Harry, trying to wrap up here. Do you have any words of wisdom or pearls to share with? We have a pretty wide variety of listeners. We have landowners, we have hunters, and we have biologists that listen. Could you think of a pearl or words of wisdom for each of those three groups that, hey, here's something to keep in mind over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, well, certainly deer management is a long-term thing. There are no magic bullets there that will overnight change things for you. And I think if there's one thing I would emphasize, it's stewardship of the resource, and realizing that deer are a keystone species. They have tremendous impact on their environment and other wildlife that occupy that environment with them. That not maintaining them in balance with their habitat seriously impacts the forest habitat and quality, and seriously impacts a whole range of other species of wildlife, from songbirds and neotropical migrants to small mammals, reptilians, you name it. They're a huge factor in environmental change, and stewardship involves taking care of that resource so it maintains a balance.
Well said.
No magic bullets. No magic bullets. Don't think on the short term. Think the long term.
Exactly.
Yeah. But one of the ways I tell that story, Harry, is that us as human beings, I think deer management is very equivalent to a diet and people wanting a diet pill. We want to just take the diet pill, and I lost 30 pounds, and I look like I've been weightlifting my entire life. And the only way to have those results is watching what you eat and the weightlifting. And I think it's very similar with deer management. Sticking with all the concepts you talked about. It's the population management. It's the doe harvest. It's managing nutrition. It's managing buck age structure. It's strategically harvesting the bucks that you do. And if you do those things consistently enough over the long term, that equals success.
Yep. Not only success, it equals enjoyment. I mean, that's the most enjoyment I get from managing deer and hunting deer is being able to pass that on to the next generation and being able to show them what that stewardship involves and how important it is to our quality of life.
All right. Well, Steve, you want to wrap us up here?
Well, Harry, it's been great visiting with you, and love the historical context and the pearls of wisdom to keep in our minds as we move forward. And you've been a generation, an inspiration to generations of deer biologists and graduate students, whether they feared you but they learned to love you and appreciate what you had to contribute to them. And I know Bronson's better for it, even though his knees may have been shaken back there years ago when you were coming up to the podium to ask a question. But you've been a great contribution to deer management nationally and to the development of a bunch of wildlife professionals that are doing good work now, following the lead that you gave them.
Well,
thank you.
Thanks for having an old man on. I appreciate it greatly, guys, and thanks for doing the work you're doing, because it's so gratifying to see that next generation kick in and make the contributions that you guys have made, and I know that your students are going to make and are making right now. So,
yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Harry. We appreciate it, and we will hopefully see you face to face at an upcoming meeting in Louisiana.
Yeah, I'm planning on it. So,
yeah, we are too.
Hope to be there. I don't know if I'll say anything controversial or not, but I'll be there.
If you'll be there, you most likely will.
We'll warn our students in advance to start worrying.
All right, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Great seeing you.
Thank you, Harry.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.